New Orleans General Hospital, located in the heart of the city, is a place with a reputation that goes beyond its medical prestige. Since its inception, it has witnessed countless births and deaths, joys and tragedies. However, within its walls, stories circulate about inexplicable events and disturbing phenomena that have left many in profound fear. Patients and medical staff have reported for decades experiences that defy logic: shadows moving in deserted hallways, whispers in empty rooms, and fleeting apparitions in the darkest hours of the night. Some may consider these stories superstitions, but they have solidified the legend of the hospital's haunting. My name is Alex Thompson, and I am a journalist. For years, I have investigated accounts of paranormal phenomena across the United States, but I had never experienced anything as personal and terrifying as what I lived through in this hospital. What began as a routine visit turned into one of the most harrowing nights of my life. It all started on a rainy night while I was returning home from Baton Rouge with my cousin David. The traffic was heavy, and the rain pounded on the windshield, making visibility difficult. Suddenly, a vehicle appeared out of nowhere and hit us head-on. The impact was brutal. I remember seeing shattered glass and feeling a sharp pain in my side before losing consciousness. When I woke up, I was on a stretcher being rushed down a hallway lit by flickering lights. The sound of sirens and the hurried voices of paramedics filled the air. David was nowhere in sight, and a growing fear gripped me. As the doctors wheeled me into the emergency room, I noticed that the hospital had an old-fashioned air, as if time had stopped at some point in the past. Once in the emergency room, the doctors began to treat my wounds. The lights flickered intermittently, and more than once I thought I saw shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. The curtains around the bed swayed slightly, even though there was no draft. It was then that I first heard the whisper, a barely audible but unmistakable sound that said my name. I looked around, but no one seemed to have heard it. At that moment, I knew something was wrong in this hospital. The sense of unease intensified as I made my way to the emergency room. The place was crowded with patients on stretchers and wheelchairs, and an air of palpable desperation filled the room. Some doctors and nurses avoided looking toward a specific corner of the room, as if it was best to ignore it. They placed me on a stretcher next to a curtain separating the patients, and as we waited for a doctor to approach, I could hear conversations around me. Patients complained of inexplicable pains, and others mentioned seeing strange things during the night. One of them, an elderly man with a bandage on his head, whispered to anyone who would listen about a figure he had seen standing at the foot of his bed. David still hadn't appeared, and my concern for his whereabouts was growing. I tried to ask a nurse, but she seemed too busy to pay attention. It was then that the lights in the room flickered again, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move quickly out of the corner of my eye. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. As the night progressed, the behavior of the medical staff became increasingly strange. Some nurses whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances down the dark hallways. A visibly worn-out doctor muttered to himself as he checked my vital signs, his hands trembling slightly. The feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. One of the doctors, seeing my unease, tried to reassure me, but his eyes betrayed a worry he couldn't hide. "Don't worry, Alex," he said. "Everything will be fine." However, his voice lacked conviction, and in his eyes I could see the reflection of a deep fear. Every time the lights flickered, his face hardened, and his movements became more hurried. I decided I had to find David. Desperate, I got up from the stretcher, ignoring the pain still lingering on my side. As I walked down the hallway looking for my cousin, I encountered a nurse who seemed completely oblivious to the chaos around us. I asked her about David, but her response was a barely audible whisper. "You shouldn't be here. They are watching you." Without saying more, she quickly walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. The nurse brought in another patient and placed her in the bed next to mine after my brief and unsettling encounter. She was a middle-aged woman with a pale face and glassy eyes. She barely moved, but her eyes were open, staring fixedly at the ceiling, as if in a trance. I tried to strike up a conversation with her, asking if she was okay. However, the woman did not respond. She just remained still, with an expression of deep terror on her face. Occasionally, her lips would move, murmuring unintelligible words. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. She had bandaged her wrists, revealing dried bloodstains on them. The woman's presence filled me with an inexplicable sense of discomfort. The lights continued to flicker, and the air around us seemed to grow colder. Suddenly, the woman turned her head towards me, her eyes meeting mine. "We're not alone here," she whispered, her voice a faint, broken echo. Before I could respond, she closed her eyes and fell into a deep sleep, leaving me with a chill running down my spine. With my mind full of questions and my body aching, I decided I needed to explore the hospital further to understand what was happening. The woman's words echoed in my mind as I left the emergency room and ventured into the dark hallways of the hospital. Each step I took seemed to amplify the whispers I had been hearing since my arrival. The main hallway was poorly lit, with only a few lights working properly. As I advanced, the whispers became clearer, as if many voices were speaking in a constant murmur. "Who's there?" I asked in a low voice, but only received the echo of my own voice in response. The walls seemed to encircle me, and the sense of surveillance was nearly intolerable. Finally, I reached an intersection in the hallways, and to my right, I saw a fleeting figure disappear around a corner. "Wait!" I shouted, hurrying after it. I rounded the corner and found myself in an even darker hallway, with closed doors on either side. In the distance, I could hear a soft cry, like that of a lost child. I followed the sound, my heart pounding, knowing I was about to discover something that could change everything I believed about this hospital. I returned to my bed, feeling a sharp pain in my side that I hadn't felt before. I lay back and tried to calm myself, though the sense of unease remained. I closed my eyes, hoping that rest would help ease the pain. Just as I was starting to drift off, I felt a presence next to me. I opened my eyes and saw a nurse standing by my bed, a serious expression on her face. "You need to rest," she said softly but firmly. "This hospital has seen many things over the years." She looked directly into my eyes, and in her gaze I could see a mix of sadness and something else, something I couldn't identify. "Do you want to know the truth about this place?" she asked. I nodded slowly, curious, and at the same time, fearful of what I was about to hear. The nurse sat in a chair next to my bed and began to speak in a low voice. She told me about the hospital's dark past, mentioning paranormal events that had occurred there. She spoke of shadows moving through the hallways, inexplicable whispers in empty rooms, and fleeting apparitions that terrified patients and staff alike. According to her, many believed that the souls of those who had died tragically in the hospital still roamed its hallways. Each word she said made the atmosphere around us heavier, and a chill ran down my spine. As the nurse continued talking, the pain in my side intensified. "You need to be careful," she continued. "There are things in this hospital that don't belong to our world." Suddenly, we heard a soft cry coming from the hallway. The nurse stood up abruptly, her expression changing to one of concern. "Stay here," she told me, but something in her tone made me feel like I had to follow her. I got up slowly, ignoring the pain, and followed the nurse down the dark hallway. The crying grew louder as we approached a partially open door. The nurse pushed the door open, revealing a small child sitting on the floor, sobbing. "Who are you?" the nurse asked gently, but urgently. The child looked up, and in his eyes, there was an indescribable terror. "I'm lost," the child murmured, tears running down his cheeks. The nurse kneeled beside him, trying to comfort him. "Everything will be fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. I approached to help, but the child suddenly stood up and began walking toward another door at the back of the room. "Follow me," he said in an eerily calm voice. The nurse and I exchanged a worried glance, but we followed the child, knowing we were about to discover something much darker and more disturbing than we could have imagined. We followed the child down a long, dark hallway, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence of the hospital. As we walked, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if we were moving through an invisible fog. Finally, the child stopped in front of a room with a partially open door. "Here it is," he whispered, barely audible. We entered the room, and to my surprise, it was empty. There was only a window at the far end, covered by worn curtains. The child approached the window and pointed with his finger. "Look there," he said, his voice trembling. I slowly approached and drew back the curtains. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the darkness of the night and the reflection of the hospital lights. But then I saw it. A pale, gaunt face appeared in the glass, its sunken eyes staring directly at me. A chill ran through my entire body and I stepped back, tripping over a chair. The nurse saw it too, and she covered her mouth with her hand, clearly terrified. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the fear remained. "We have to get out of here," the nurse said urgently, and the child nodded, trembling. We hurried out of the room, fear driving us to move faster. The child led us through a maze of hallways, each darker and more desolate than the last. Finally, we arrived at a small break room where the nurse tried to calm us down. That face. "I've seen it before," she confessed. "It belonged to a nurse who worked here years ago, but disappeared without a trace." The story of the missing nurse was known among the older staff. According to rumors, she had been a dedicated and kind young woman, but one day she simply did not show up for work. Extensive searches failed to locate her body. Some said she had run away. Others whispered that her spirit still roamed the hospital hallways seeking help. While the nurse told us this story, the child remained silent, staring at the floor. "I've seen her too," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "She sometimes comes to me when I'm alone. She expresses her plight and requests assistance." The child's words added a new level of horror to our situation. The nurse stood up and decided that we should ask the head of security for answers. We couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. After hearing the story of the disappeared nurse, we decided to ask the head of security for answers. We quickly walked through the hallways until we found a small office with a sign that said, "Security." The nurse knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, a middle-aged man with a worn expression opened it. "We need your help," the nurse said urgently. "Something strange is happening in the hospital. There's a child who led us to a room where we saw the face of a missing woman." The head of security frowned, but let us in and closed the door behind us. "Listen," he said as he sat at his desk. "I've worked here for over 20 years, and I've heard many stories. I know about the missing nurse and the things people say they've seen, but no one has found concrete evidence. If you really saw something, we need to investigate. Years have passed since the closure of a room. Some say it's haunted. Let's see what we find there." He took a flashlight and led us back into the dark hallway. We walked in silence, with the flashlight illuminating our path, until we reached a metal door with a rusty sign that read, "Restricted Access." "This is it," said the head of security, his voice barely a whisper. "No one has entered here in years." A chill ran down my spine as he inserted an old key into the lock and opened the door. The door opened with an eerie creak, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. The air was cold and heavy, and a sense of unease enveloped us as we crossed the threshold. The room was filled with obsolete medical equipment, rusty beds, and scattered files. A white sheet covered a stretcher in the center, and the dense atmosphere made breathing difficult. The head of security shone his flashlight on the stretcher and, lifting the sheet, revealed the skeleton of a woman in a nurse's uniform. The nurse beside me gasped and stepped back, covering her mouth with her hands. "It's her," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The head of security approached slowly and examined the remains. "I'll call the police," he said somberly. "This needs to be officially investigated." While he made the call, the nurse and I stood staring at the skeleton, a feeling of terror mixed with relief that we had finally discovered the truth. In the midst of the confusion, we realized that the child who had guided us here had disappeared. We searched the entire room, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. This fact only increased our sense of unease. The following days were a whirlwind of events. I finally found my cousin David, who had been in the intensive care unit due to his severe injuries. Fortunately, he was recovering, though he was still weak and shaken by what had happened. After leaving the hospital, the memories of that night persisted in haunting me. I knew I had to tell what had happened, so I wrote a detailed article about everything for the newspaper I work for. The publication of the story stirred significant controversy, but for me, it transcended mere news. It served as a poignant reminder of the unexplainable nature of the world and the enigmatic secrets that New Orleans General Hospital may never fully uncover. I really hope you liked this tale. I am thrilled to share these stories with you. Share this video with others so that we can keep growing and more stories can reach more people. Kindly provide your thoughts and experiences in the comments section. It will aid in my further development. If you like the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Many thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.